Failure sucks in any context. It hurts, it can be uncomfortable, it can be dangerous, and it can be our fault or completely out of our control. Failing can mean missing out on life-changing opportunities. It can mean losing a loved one, or it can just be annoying. But, and I promise you, this is true, you need failure. In fact, you crave it. If you ever got annoyed at Atreus for screaming the answers to puzzles at you in God of War Ragnarok, then you know what I mean. Or maybe you're the kind of person who plays Pokemon Nuzlocke because the original games are just too easy for you. Or maybe you're a Dark Souls sicko because you love the thrill of completely wiping to a boss 15 times and then barely eking out a win. Hell, even the games that we call cozy have rules and goals to meet and difficulty to overcome. Because we don't like it when things are too easy. We need a challenge. As Jesper Juul says in his book, The Art of Failure, I dislike failing in games, but I dislike not failing even more. We need, if not actual failure, then at least the possibility of failure. Otherwise, many of life's experiences feel worthless. Even I, who had to quit playing Marvel Snap because the ranked ladder in that game was affecting my mental health, need to feel like I might fail. Otherwise, what am I even winning? So how do we rationalize these two ideas? That we dislike failure, but that we also need it? When is failure good? This is Flow State, a show about the games we get lost in, and today I'm going to try and answer that question. Citizen Sleeper 2's Hexport demo begins with a sleeper in crisis. A sleeper is an emulated consciousness inside of a manufactured body, created by a corporation for slave labor. The corporations in this world protect their assets by building sleepers' bodies to require a drug known as stabilizer. At the beginning of the sequel, the sleeper we're playing is being rebooted in an attempt to remove their reliance on this stabilizer. Only the process fails because it's forcibly interrupted. The sleeper wakes up in a panic.
It is a scrambled, panicked fear. The drowning fear, the falling fear, the fear that makes you reach desperately for any stable point. It is the fear that tells you something is wrong. Something is very wrong with you.
This sleeper wakes up having forgotten their companion, Seraphin, the person who was helping them with this reboot. There's clearly a past the sleeper has with Seraphin, but the sleeper doesn't remember it, so we don't learn about it. But it's clear that these two had built some kind of life on the shoddy foundation of a stabilizer dealer named Lane. And when they tried to free themselves of their reliance on Lane, that life fell apart. The first Citizen Sleeper was a game where you could fail. That said, especially in the late game, many players criticized Citizen Sleeper because they felt that it got easier as the in-game economy eased up and made you more comfortable. At the beginning of the game, your sleeper is barely surviving, only just getting by. And then, as they build connections on Erland's Eye, the space station that game was set on, they build something of a stable life. I said in my original Citizen Sleeper video that this progression from having nothing to getting by on the kindness of others was more writing than it was an issue with the game's mechanics. It seemed to me like a narrative progression of relative safety that the game's developer Gareth Damian Martin intended. But in Citizen Sleeper 2, Starward Vector, Gareth wants you to fail.
Yeah, I'm Gareth Damian Martin, and my pronouns are they, them.
Was there any player feedback that you took into this game? And I'm curious to know.
Yeah, I mean, loads, yeah. Because I had that distance and that time, yeah, I read so many reviews and so many people's feedback and thoughts. And, I really picked up that, okay, some people really like the way the game kind of balances itself out in the end, which is part of the kind of arc of the game. But some people didn't like that. And I was like, okay, well, that's a really interesting thing to try to deal with. Especially when I knew early on that I wanted this theme of crisis. And I was thinking a lot about how do you, how mechanically do you have a crisis happen, and how do you continue that crisis? Or what is a crisis? Or what is many layers of crisis happening simultaneously? What do we mean by crisis? A lot of that came from feedback of thinking about the difference between how you would graph out Citizen Sleeper 1, where it's all about you get up to the top and then you have this linear decline. And at some point you avert the linear decline, and the kind of the frequency of that waveform is like your experience, right? Like,
Mhm.
and as the game goes on, the waveform becomes more frequent as you have more resource. While like when I graphed out Citizen Sleeper 2, it's like you're fine, and there's like you drop off a cliff, and then you like kind of come back up a little bit, and then you're like, oh shit, I've got another contract, and then you drop off the cliff, and then you like suddenly get lucky and you go up and so it's got this like really dynamic pace and structure that is quite different. And that was really a reaction to kind of player feedback, and also my own thoughts and my own feedback about the game. I mean, when you make a game, you don't feel it's perfect, so you often have like things you wanted to do differently.
In both Citizen Sleeper games, you roll a number of 6-sided dice at the beginning of every day. The values of those dice are what you use to take actions in the game. If you assign a 6 to a task, it's guaranteed that that action will succeed. But if you assign a 1, it's far more likely that you'll fail, and there will be in-game consequences for that failure. In Citizen Sleeper 1, those consequences were things like rolling fewer dice, losing money, or losing energy, which would require you to find and buy stabilizer at usually a very high cost. In the sequel, Gareth has designed a new system where as you fail at various tasks, you gain stress. And as you gain more stress, there's a chance your dice will break. And that costs you serious time and resources to repair. They call this the crisis system.
So I even like in my head, I call the like new dice system is like the crisis system in my mind. Like that was the intent. It's like to create this feeling of like being on the edge of a structure that is like falling apart, and then suddenly like the key like the key piece that's holding it all together goes, and right. You don't know when that piece might go, but it can go, and then all of a sudden it's like he's just trying to survive.
Even in video games, away from any real consequences, people fear failure. As much as Gareth wants to use failure as a tool for storytelling, they've heard players be concerned about failing in Citizen Sleeper.
I've seen people on the Discord and stuff say like, oh yeah, don't worry, like Citizen Sleeper's a game where you fail. And I'm like, oh, that's great. That's what I want. I want that license to even people, when people say, oh, sometimes it's more interesting when you fail. I'm like, okay, yeah, like I want people to think like that. I want to get people into that space. And so in Citizen Sleeper 2, there's lots of interesting things that happen when you fail. And there's like crew members that you can only get if you fail certain things and things like this. There's all kinds of like ways that stories can play out. That's been me focusing on trying to push that side of the game.
I'll admit that as much as I see the opportunity for failure to be positive, I personally am terrified of failure. I'm the exact kind of person who was asking those questions to my friends in Discord when I played the first Citizen Sleeper. Was I supposed to fail that quest? Did I do something wrong? Forgive me if you've heard this one before, but I grew up with a combination of privilege, a natural ability in school, a neurodivergent brain, and a decent singing voice. And this meant that I was good at a lot of things that impressed the adults in my life, like school and music, all without needing to try very hard. Over time, that led to my interests being shaped more by what I was naturally good at, rather than whether or not those things were actually interesting to me. This is a potent recipe for hating failure and having a deep distaste for having to spend any time getting better at anything. I've talked openly on this channel about what the Marvel Snapped ranked ladder did to my mental health, largely because I enjoyed it, but I wasn't naturally great at it. That was a game that I had to talk to my therapist about, because no matter how stupid I thought it was that I felt this way, dropping a rank in Marvel Snap made me feel horrible about myself. Another place this anxiety shows up in my life is publishing videos on YouTube. These videos, they take a lot of work, and I think the point of art is to think about and discuss it together. But there's a very real fear that no one will ever see the things that I make because some algorithm decided not to show it to you, or because not enough people clicked the like button and left a comment. These things might not seem real or meaningful, but the risks of failure don't have to be tangible to cause very real anxiety in a person. So why then do we hate when games have zero potential for failure? Why do I put myself through this? Jesper Juhl, who I mentioned earlier, is a games researcher and designer at the Danish Design School, and he calls this question the paradox of failure. In his book, The Art of Failure, an essay on the pain of playing video games, he defines the paradox of failure with 3 statements. 1. We generally avoid failure. 2. We experience failure when playing games. And 3, we seek out games, although we will experience something we would normally avoid. Jesper proposes a handful of solutions to the paradox of failure, but the solution that he leads with is that we approach failure in games as a way to overcome inadequacy.
My argument is that the paradox of failure is unique in that when you fail in a game, it really means that you were in some way inadequate. Such a feeling of inadequacy is unpleasant for us, and it is odd that we choose to subject ourselves to it. However, while games uniquely induce such feelings of being inadequate, they also motivate us to play more in order to escape the same inadequacy. And the feeling of escaping failure, often by improving our skills, is central to the enjoyment of games.
If you're unfortunate enough to be steeped in corporate America, as long as I have been, you might know the term growth mindset. At its simplest, growth mindset is the innocuous and I think correct idea that anything can be learned, and that assuming that you are inherently bad at something is a way to ensure that you will never be good at it. At its worst, growth mindset is a culty, unscientific way of treating your employees poorly based on the kind of book that your boss's boss's boss can't shut up about. Yule is essentially, but not directly, saying that the value that we get out of games that provide the potential for failure comes from a growth mindset. Games set clear goals, rules, and obstacles that make learning possible. Then, when we clear those obstacles and master those goals and rules, the game establishes new ones. The presentation of these obstacles and our ability to overcome them is the value. All this talk about games is great, but if we try to apply this understanding of failure to the real world, we'll see it fall apart. Behavior change in the real world is hard, and in the real world, not everyone learns from failure. In a paper titled The Exaggerated Benefits of Failure, researchers found that
predictors overestimated the likelihood that professionals who fail a professional exam pass a retest, the likelihood that patients improve their health after a crisis, and the probability, more generally, of learning from one's mistakes.
basically we are far less likely to learn from our mistakes than we think we are. To further complicate this understanding of failure, let's remember that in the real world, not everyone gets the same opportunities to recover from failure, and not everyone has the same definition of failure applied to their actions in the first place. Thriving in crisis and moving through failure are things that queer people have been doing since probably the beginning of time. As queer people, we define success completely differently than the rest of the world, and that can and does lead to us being left behind and being seen as failures. In his book, The Queer Art of Failure, queer scholar Jack Halberstam wrote extensively about failure in the context of queerness. In 2013, Halberstam and Yule were brought together at the Queerness and Games Conference to talk about their similarly titled books that both attempted to answer similar questions. In that conversation, Halberstam described the idea of queer failure.
If the winning of the game of capitalism means accumulating wealth, then it may well be that anti-capitalists want to fail at that game in order to produce other ways of thinking about money, other ways of thinking about being in relationship through property, possession, whatever it may be. But if you move to the realm of heterosexuality and heteronormativity, the queer becomes the kind of the failure line of logic. Now, within a homophobic logic, the queer fails to be straight, literally. The butch fails to be a woman. The sissy boy fails to be a man. The queer adult fails to get married and have children, fails in their socially prescribed role. So there are two responses you can have to that. One is to try to play the game as it's being written, right? And say, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't realize I will now get married and have children, and then maybe you will accept me as a success in your terms, or you refuse the game. And you say, actually, that outcome is not desired for me, and you rewrite the game, and in the process, you accept the label of failure. So that acceptance of failure, that investment in failure, that excitement about failure is a queer art of failure.
Halberstam rejects mainstream heteronormative ideas of success, which are inherently tied to capitalism and compulsory heterosexuality, and instead asks, what kind of rewards can failure offer us? I want to give a content warning on the next minute or so. If you'd like not to hear stories of homophobia within families, just skip to the next chapter of this video or in your podcast app. I totally understand. I grew up north of Tulsa, Oklahoma, going to a small private Christian school that my family could only afford because my grandmother worked there. She raised my sister and I alongside my dad for reasons that I don't need to get into here, and I'm genuinely thankful to her for doing that. She invested a lot of time and money and effort into us, and it is the privilege of having someone that cared that much about me and had the resources to help me succeed that's led to where I am today. But my grandma is a homophobe. It's everything that you might imagine. She took us to the megachurch she attended in the buckle of the Bible Belt. It was her idea for us to go to that Christian school. I grew up very deeply involved in the evangelical Christian world, but I also didn't know anything about my identity until I was an adult. When I went to college, it took about a year for me to realize my own queerness, and I honestly accepted that about myself very quickly. It took longer for me to realize that I didn't believe in the things that I'd been raised to believe. But I was happy. I lived pretty openly for several years, moving from being out to a few friends to out in my college town, then to out to some of my family, and then out to everyone except my grandma. In this time, I discovered more about who I was outside of my sexuality. I found new people and new things to love. I learned about self-motivation and how to find value on my own without the approval of parental figures. And I got into my dream grad school program all by myself. And of course, I met the guy who'd become my husband. We got married around Christmas one year, and we did that back in Oklahoma. My grandma still didn't know, and my husband and I were having really difficult conversations about me needing to tell her, but I didn't get to do that. Someone else in the family told her, and I got a phone call from her the day after we got back. It went the way that you would expect. She said awful things. I was devastated, and we haven't spoken since. But a year or so later, a different family member told me a story of something that happened that week after Christmas. My grandma and that family member had gone shopping, and when they pulled back into my grandma's driveway, she didn't want to get out of the car and go inside. And she told this family member it was because there had been a death in the family. Here I was in probably the happiest moment of my life, finding success that I had never dreamed of. I loved a person I never could have imagined would love me the way that he did. I was about to graduate with a degree from an extremely well-respected university. By any measure, but more importantly, by my measure, I was a success. But to her, I was such a failure that she'd rather pretend that I was dead. I don't tell you this story to make you pity me or to make you sad. I simply want to illustrate the ways in which queer people's successes are seen as failure in what Jack Halberstam called the homophobic context. Even a person like me, who is in a much safer and broadly respected position than many other of my queer siblings, experiences the ideas of queer failure. Queer people are so adept at rejecting heteronormative ideas of success in relationships, sexuality, gender, and gender roles. Surely we have something to offer in this discussion of failure. The moderator of that panel I showed you earlier was named Bo Ruberg. Bo is a queer games studies scholar, and they wrote a paper called No Fun: The Queer Potential of Video Games That Annoy, Anger, Disappoint, Sadden, and Hurt. In this paper, they use both Halberstam's and Yule's work to address the paradox of failure.
Although Jules' insistence that failure is a critical part of almost every game is refreshing, his conceptualization of the paradox of failure hinges on a set of normative assumptions: that players hate failing and love winning, and that the painful experience of failing at games only makes sense if it drives players to succeed. Even though Jewel focuses on experiences that are no fun, he still operates under the expectation that fun is the point of video games.
Instead, Ruberg proposes several new no-fun ways that games can be meaningful. In The Queer Art of Failure, Halberstam found alternative queer definitions of success and failure, and Ruberg applies this same idea to video games. Ruberg breaks down no fun into a handful of modes of negative affect, which for the purposes of this video, you can think of as negative emotion that players might find valuable. Ruberg discusses disappointing games, annoying games, boring games, alarming games, sad games, games that hurt by design, and games that hurt by player choice. I won't break them all down here, but let's talk about some of them. The most interesting one to me is games that hurt by player choice. Ruberg discusses a particular round of Mario Kart Battle Mode where they kept intentionally losing as a way of enjoying themselves. I can think of similar instances where I've repeatedly walked off a cliff or into an enemy's attack simply because I was frustrated with the game. It was a way of expressing a feeling that I needed to express. It wasn't fun, but it was valuable to me. That sad games have value is obvious to me. I know that there are people out there who don't enjoy stories that make you cry, and I would agree that when a game or a story is doing that without any depth, that I also don't enjoy it. But when a game presents me with a tragic choice, and I'm forced to reckon with the narrative and personal repercussions of that choice, I absolutely appreciate that feeling. No spoilers here, but at the end of Persona 3 Reload, when the game is very obviously winding down, choosing which characters I would spend time with in the game's last days meant a lot to me. I chose to specifically dedicate time to Koromaru and the bookshop couple because those were the characters that I felt the most connected to. Leaving them behind felt like a real loss. Feeling that loss, something I've felt in the real world, wasn't just catharsis. It was something a bit more profound in a way that I don't think I can fully explain. Ruberg's idea of no fun games resonates with me, especially in the context of Citizen Sleeper. The most meaningful part of the first game, to me, was a moment that you might call a failure. I had my sleeper decide not to join their found family on a long-distance voyage across space, instead choosing to stay behind and live amongst the community that they had become a part of. For me, the bittersweetness was the value of that decision. In Citizen Sleeper 2, that starting failure, that interrupted reboot, leads to a narrative thread that I'm eager to see more of in the full game. This sleeper has forgotten who Seraphin, their supposed companion, was to them. What is this relationship? Who is Seraphin at all? And can this sleeper remember, or are they going to have to completely rebuild? When I failed a contract in the Citizen Sleeper 2 demo, a crew member who had previously been reserved and closed off opened themselves up to me a bit. Because I had failed, I now had access to a character I might not have had before. These are the narrative threads that pull me forward. They are the value. But this kind of thing doesn't follow in the real world. In a game, failure's an opportunity. And in life, no matter what the business gurus tell you, for most of us, it isn't. In The Art of Failure, Ewell discusses the concept of gamification, the idea of lifting measurement and incentives out of games and placing them in the real world. This is something he believes cannot work because in the real world, measurement and incentives lead to unexpected outcomes. He gives the example of the 2008 financial crisis, where performance measures on the employees of certain financial institutions ended up incentivizing risky loans that led to the collapse of those institutions.
As it happens, games do not have the problem of measurement because they are ideal instances of performance goals. Games have no difference between the intended output, success and failure, and the performance measure, success and failure. The value system that the goal of a game creates is not an artificial measure of the value of the player's performance. The goal is what creates the value in the first place by assigning values to the possible outcomes of a game.
When I read this example, I had a question. Who gets to fail? Famously, in the 2008 financial crisis, the people in power decided that the banks were too big to fail. These massive institutions and the people that led them got bailed out, but the millions of people who lost their homes or savings, they didn't get the benefit of that doubt. Wall Street got to learn from their failures and move on to try again, but the people harmed by their mistakes just had to make do. These moments of regular people in crisis are the things that Gareth is hoping to simulate in Citizen Sleeper 2.
I started thinking about like who joins a crew of like just a ship that's already on the run, and it's like, well, it's people who are on the run from something. Like all of these people, they share that they're on the run somehow, but you can be on the run in lots of different ways, and you can be in a crisis in lots of different ways. And so that became really important to me, is thinking about a series of characters who are kind of in this transition zone between one thing and another thing, and you are kind of in that transition zone as well, in this crisis of transition of trying to figure out where you're going, and that's super important. I think like that was really heavily affected as well during development during the development of this game. Like I had surgery twice. I had the same surgery twice. The first time it didn't take, and that idea of like being between two surgeries or like having to do the same thing twice. Like that really kind of, I don't know, brought a lot of thoughts to my mind about, about kind of difficulty and entropy and how you hold things together and how things fall apart. And I think that's kind of what has become then in time as I work through these things as working on the game. A lot of the writing really became about this tension between if we're building something, if we're building a crew, we're always building it in the knowledge, or building like a home, or we're always building in the knowledge that it will eventually like fall apart. And how do we resolve ourselves to that?
Experiencing crisis in the safety of a video game is one thing, but in the real world, we have every reason to fear this kind of failure. Failure can easily lead to very real tragedy, something the video games industry should be extremely aware of. If you don't know it, the video games industry is in a really bad spot. Bad bets, ballooning development timelines, oversized development budgets, and an oversaturated video games market have made financial failure into existential crisis. Games have to sell, not just well, but exceptionally well. Otherwise, entire studios will be forced to shutter. And even then, sometimes success isn't enough. I listen to several video game news podcasts, and for the last 2 years, you cannot go a single week without hearing a news story about either a studio shutdown or layoffs at a game studio. It's dire out there. Hell, I'd love to quit my stupid corporate job and get into the games industry, but if I want to pay my bills consistently and work a normal amount of hours, that's just not a smart move. And since I had the developer of probably my favorite game of all time on video with me, I asked Gareth how they were making it work. How much do you think about the business of making games? Like as much as the stories that you told in at least the first Citizen Sleeper were about like the capitalistic hell we live in, we do live in it, and I imagine that that's something you have to consider when making games.
Yeah,
how
definitely.
much do you think about it? What is it? How does it shape your decisions?
Yeah, I mean, it's my life because I'm a solo. I'm the director of the business that is me. That is my company, and so the business side is something that I have to deal with constantly. I think because I had this what I feel is a very advantageous background is that I didn't go straight into making games. I spent a lot of my time doing other things because I never really thought I'm not really a programmer, although I am kind of now, but I don't write any code. I program using visual scripting. And because of that, back when I was younger, it was basically not really possible for me to make games. And I was okay with that. I never really wanted to join like AAA games. I very much enjoyed being an artist, and I wanted to spend my time being an artist. And I worked in theater and worked kind of in illustration, and then ended up working in motion graphics for theater and exhibitions, and a lot of video and projection design for theater and things like this. And at the same time, I was doing a lot of writing, and I wrote, like I did a PhD in literature, and kind of was just like played around with a lot of things. And I think I saw a lot of other people's companies and a lot of other people's creative businesses. And I constantly saw that you would start with like a really small room full of like really cool and exciting, interesting people, really excited to make cool stuff. And then within like 5 years, you would have a room of like 20 people, all of whom needed to be paid. And the only jobs that the company could take on were suddenly like the worst jobs for the worst clients, the most boring, least risky work. And I promised myself that if I ever had the opportunity to do something myself, I would never do this. And so when it came to making games and having success within other waters, I was always like, okay, this is just a space for me. And my collaborators, they come in and they work with me, and they get a share of what we make, and they get like, that's they're very kind of like well rewarded for what they do, but they're not part of this structure. I don't have any employees. And that's just kind of how I'm okay with kind of like having a business and running like that. That kind of feels comfortable to me, to have people I work with and kind of contribute to their lives fairly, and to just run things very openly. And also, but not everybody's always in that position. So I have a lot of sympathy for trying to build structures and businesses around making games. But yeah, it's rough. But I have the massive advantage that I'm just one person, and that gives me a lot of possibility. But I guess the other thing that gives me, I feel, is a lot of responsibility. I think games and the business of making games, the more difficult it gets, the more I see like people being risk averse. But the thing I worry is like that risk averseness is not happening like at the low end, right? Where people actually don't have anything. Those people who are making games on a shoestring, they're usually making the most exciting stuff. is actually like studios that have 3 or 4 games, they seem to just kind of like bend towards a kind of like generic and well-established structures. And I think this is really sad. So yeah, as a successful studio that's just me, I do feel kind of responsible of like, okay, I have to make risky stuff, because otherwise, like, what's going to happen to this medium really if I don't make it? So there's kind of like where I end up on the business side is I'm by being in a comfortable position, I need to put myself in an uncomfortable position creatively.
Right.
That makes sense to me.
Near the end of Citizen Sleeper 2's Hexport demo, my sleeper went out on a contract. It was a scrap mission to a derelict ship. Seraphin could barely dock with the thing because of how fragile this dead ship was. The sleeper and Seraphin had brought along Junie, a data extractor the two had met back on the Hexport. This is a new addition to Citizen Sleeper 2. You'll find contracts that require you to put together a crew, travel to another place, and complete a task over a series of days. Each day, you'll have your dice available to complete actions, but you'll also have 2 dice from each crew member. Crucially, in the Derelict contract, I was made familiar with Citizen Sleeper 2's class system. Depending on a character's class, they'll be better or worse at different kinds of tasks. This is represented by minuses or pluses that change the value of any given die. In this contract, you can see the classes represented as different colors. And you can see here that in this contract, almost all of these reduce the value of my crew's dice. That means there's a higher chance that those tasks will fail. Failure of a task within a contract does 2 things. It can add to the stress level of the sleeper, eventually leading to dice taking damage, breaking, and needing repair. But failure also adds stress to the contract. And with enough stress, a crisis might trigger. In the case of the Derelict, if there were 4 active crises, I would fail the contract. Every action I took on this contract felt dangerous. It felt like I was putting these characters at risk in a way that I frankly didn't feel a lot in Citizen Sleeper. But as I continued this seemingly doomed mission, the crises forced these characters to interact with each other. Seraphin showed some of his feelings about my sleeper's memory loss. Junie made it clear that she knew more about this wreckage than she'd let on so far. I did ask Gareth if it was even possible to pass this contract, and they said that it was, so I just did something wrong. I eventually got to the point where bad rolls and stupid mistakes meant that all my sleeper could do was rest and wake up to a 4th active crisis. So the ship broke apart. This crew didn't get what they were looking for, and their rig was hurt in the attempt. When they got back to the Hexport, Junie pulled Seraphin and the sleeper aside. She told them why she had wanted the core of the Derelict. She was honest and open with the 2 of them when she'd spent the whole mission mysterious and reserved. And she offered another way to get the gear that these 2 needed in the first place. The game had rewarded my failure with narrative, something I first saw back when Hades came out in 2020. In The Art of Failure, Yule discusses the difference between real failure and fictional failure. In this case, real failure would have been my failing to mechanically complete the contract by assigning dice to various tasks. Fictional failure would be the crew failing to complete the contract, foregoing their bounty, and watching the ship disintegrate. Yule says that issues can arise when there's misalignment between real failure and fictional success, or the other way around. But I believe that in this case, rewarding failure with narrative is actually a clever way of using that misalignment effectively. This is not a new concept. Hades famously rewarded a failed run with new dialogue back in your home base. This was the thing that pulled me through that game and eventually led to my love for the roguelite genre. Again, this falls apart if we try to apply it to the real world. Narrative and characters are not rewards for failure in real life. Occasionally, we might see meeting someone during hardship to be a blessing, but also would still have preferred to not have gone through that crisis. Games allow us a space to safely navigate crisis and failure and to see what's on the other side. And this, I believe, is the answer to Yule's paradox of failure. Yule's explanation of the value of failure being in overcoming inadequacy makes a lot of sense in a lot of cases. I don't think that it's wrong by any stretch, at least not universally. Hell, it might even be true in certain protected spaces in the real world. But I believe Ruberg's and Halberstam's work point to another solution to the paradox of failure, informed by queer failure, one that acknowledges the value of failure itself rather than as a step towards fun. Maybe we enjoy failure in games as a way of exposing ourselves to risk without actual endangerment. Maybe it's a power fantasy, an old school reason for enjoying a video game. The fantasy of the first Citizen Sleeper was surviving oppression and building a supportive community on the edge of capitalist dystopia. It was about building a life in a place that felt unlivable. The full game isn't out yet, but if Gareth's words are any clue, I think the fantasy of Citizen Sleeper 2 might be in weathering crisis with a community and finding what lies beyond failure in a world where you're given that chance. Citizen Sleeper 2 Starward Vector releases in full in 2025. If it sounds interesting to you, Gareth has a request. What should people do after watching this video? What do you want them to go do?
They should wishlist Citizen Sleeper 2, obviously. So we must all bow down to the Steam gods and wishlist the game. No, but that's the most effective thing they could do. If they also want to, they could also sign up to the Jump Over the Age Substack if they wanted information. That's probably the best place these days, seeing as all the social media platforms are terrible. At least Substack, I've got your email, and I will keep it for the rest of my life in a secret place so I can send you my thoughts.
Thank you to Gareth for talking to me for this video, and also thanks for making one of the best video games I've ever played. Thank you to Alexander Avila for help with the concept and script for this video, and thank you for watching. It really does help if you like the video on YouTube or leave a comment or think about subscribing. And honestly, a way that you can help really easily is just put one of my playlists in a muted tab and leave it in the background. And hey, this video took a ton of work and honestly a decent chunk of money, to the point that even if it does super well, I'm really unlikely to make even a fifth of what I spent back on this video. So if you're interested in supporting thoughtful, long-form games criticism, or you just want to help me out, you can go over to ko-fi.com/MattHorton. If you set up any monthly recurring donation, any amount, you'll get access to the developer interview from this video, as well as the one from the 1000 Times Resist video. And also you'll get access to a members-only podcast called Can't Put It Down. Thank you again for watching, and I will talk to you next time.